Hello, my name is Adam Bean and welcome to the 66th edition of Airhacks TV, and today with the following questions. So before we start, first, today I released the next episode of Airhacks FM podcast with Emmanuel Bernard, the first line of Quarkus, and so we discussed the road from JPA to Quarkus. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was the longest episode so far, and also their episode Keycloak as Fun was also released with Sebastian Blanc, and then the episode with Matthias Reinig about web standards startup or MicroProfile in Jakarta EE startup was released as well. So this about podcast. Also, I released something interesting. So I hope interesting somehow. There is an S2I Source to image Whitefly image on Docker was released, and this you might ask, why we need source to image for Whitefly, because there is an open source one, but this one is based on DocLens image. So the image also comes from DocLens. So there is an S2I DocLens image from Whitefly, and it is somewhere here, Whitefly S2I with Dockerfile, and as you see, it inherits from Java S2I, and it downloads Whitefly and gives you the opportunity to add your own layers like JDBC drivers, SSL certificates, and whatever. And the S2I image or the S2I build will take is based on the S2I edition of the S2I DocLens image and uses it as a base. So this was released, or actually already used. Now there are the two news regarding DocLens and Whitefly, and workshops. So all workshops will take place in November and December. So we have sufficient, almost too many attendees. For both editions, and MicroProfile in Jakarta is a little bit more popular than web standards, but we have enough attendees. So if you like, just register next time. Otherwise, we will close it probably in one point of time. So or close the registrations on the workshops. Now, so we have that, and now before we start with the first question, I would like to answer some questions from the blog. And I forgot actually to do it the last time, so therefore. So the first one, blog comment, is the question number 14, Jakarta archetype. And someone asked me here, what about Jakarta E? Whether I will publish a Jakarta E archetype if in case Jakarta E becomes available? Absolutely. So so far I have released Java E7, Java E8, and Java E8 and MicroProfile archetypes, as well as Quarky archetype, which creates a Quarkus project with all popular Jakarta E dependencies. And I will of course use Jakarta E. I'm actually thinking about extending the archetype, or adding or creating a new archetype with a BCE structure and system tests, a little bit more added value. So this is the question number 1 answered. Now then, Quarkus scheduler in Kubernetes. So I got great feedback from Zemyak, and he said, anyway, in cloud environment, OpenShift Kubernetes, I would recommend not to use Quarkus or Java native schedulers. And he's actually right, because the problem with scheduler is it has to fire once in the whole cluster, and the question is now, who is the king? So who is the master? Who will who is the master of the schedule? Otherwise, every node will fire once, so you get too many iterations. And if you have Kubernetes comes with own scheduler, so you could use the Kubernetes scheduler. So this was a feedback, and it was feedback to the scheduler or Quarkus scheduler. So what I did here, I implemented a proprietary or implemented. I shown how to use a proprietary quarkus scheduler with at scheduled, which is a replacement of scheduler annotations from EJB timers. So this is the EJB way. It is schedule, and the quarkus has an annotation scheduled, which is very similar to EJB3, but is not the EJB3 annotation. So quarkus does not support EJB3. Okay, so now we covered this. And the recent comment is, this was a data access object reader's question. So I got lots of questions, but it's already a few years ago. So 6 years ago. But I got a recent comment and it says, not at all, I still use, so there's not at all. I think I don't know to what relates to not at all. I guess that the reader here likes DAOs. This is my interpretation. But I still use an abstract class with class type and ID for generic methods such as find by ID, find all, merge, and so forth. In this way, I don't have to rewrite the wheel for every DAO I create. And this is what I don't understand, because find by ID is already implemented by the entity manager. The method is called find. Find all is a named query. And merge comes with the entity manager. So at least find by ID and merge comes out of the box with entity manager. So there's nothing to reinvent. You can just use straight the entity manager without any additional, plumbing. And the only thing, find all. Okay, you could implement find all, but what you could also do, you could implement, a static method in an interface and pass the entity manager. And the entity manager just to invoke find all. So find all is a trivial. It's like select A from object A. So this is what you will have to do. Fine. So finally, we covered all the comments from my blog, the recent, and now the very first question, reader's question, and I would like to cover the gist here. Okay. Now the very first question is. Fact is, Whitefly is very slow with adoption of MicroProfile for unknown reasons. It's actually crazy because Red Hat implements Thorntail and Whitefly Swarm, so they have everything already, but Whitefly is very slow with the adoption. And the question is what to do. So what we did in my projects is we used with Whitefly successfully small rye. It's called small rye. And for instance, quarkus uses also small rye implementations. What small rye is? Small rye is the implementation of MicroProfile APIs, so you can use it out of the box. And we used JSON Web Token and fault tolerance or we used small rye dependencies to patch Whitefly to support MicroProfile, so it worked out of the box. I didn't test the Open API thing, but we used JSON Web Token and fault tolerance and I think Metrics. So there were the 3 APIs already used. And Open API, in my eyes, is optional because in most projects with the Open API, the developers tend to use Open API the same way they use Javadoc. So so get customers, and you will see in Open API the method returns list of customers. So it's there is no edit information. Okay, so now thank you. And the next one is a very interesting question, and I had actually a very similar problem, or I think even already discussed on the EHEX. It was several years ago. And my understanding is the following. So you have a table, let's say, and it's crucial that the state of the table is consistent across all clients. And in this particular case means the value should not drop below 0. And the problem is, of course, you have many concurrent clients, it may happen. So the question is what you could do. And so as always, you have actually 2 choices. You can try to solve it optimistically or pessimistically. And pessimistically would mean select for updates. So you would read the entity and log the table and then write it back. And optimistically is somehow similar, but you get two locks, one lock at read time and another lock at write back time. And with the optimistic locking, what will happen is that you will get a version ID, which is the version number in a table, which is constantly increased on every change. And if someone tries to write back the entity, or it doesn't have to be the entity, you could just use straight JDBC back to the table with wrong version number, the persistence will detect that and throw optimistic lock exception in case of JPA, and whatever you like in case you implement the layer. What's crucial is it has to be one single SQL statement. So regardless whether it is JPA, Hibernate, or whatever, it has to be one single statement. It has to be atomic. So so this was of course very strict because you are locking, and if you're doing this, it will cost you, of course, concurrency and so scalability. So instead of modeling a account, what you can model are the transactions. So, but this will lose your constraint. So it means instead of locking the account table, you could just add transactions and recompute in every add the total balance. So and then it will boils down to actually two transactions. The first one will check, and then you can say in case everything is okay, then go with that, which is more or less optimistic. So so how to prevent that? So we already discussed that. You can only prevent that with locking, pessimistic or optimistic locking, or rethinking the business logic instead of modeling the accounts, modeling a list of transactions. Yeah, this is what you can do. And I think the best would be to rethink what you are doing here, I mean, from the business perspective, and do something similar. What Amazon is always the best example. So you can always order things, but if they are not available, then you won't get them. So you get an email, dear customer, the item is not available right now. And this would mean I try to deduct some money from my account or withdraw some money from my account, and but the account is already zero, so I get exception afterwards. I cannot do this. So this is what you could do. You know, this is like not modeling the use case withdrawal, rather withdrawal attempt, and whether it takes place or not, it depends on the internal state. So very good. Dempile asked me, or ask us, in the communication between two microservices, you said that we should copy and paste the entity into two. Because if they're shared, if the jar changes, everything changes. How would you implement the Outbox transactional pattern in order to notify the other microservice that data has changed? So what the Outbox transactional pattern means is, what you usually would like to do is you would like to change the state in a table and send a message in the same transaction. So the simplest possible implementation of the pattern is, and we actually discussed it in the true airhacks.com workshop at Munich Airport. So we discussed it for 2 hours because there were some attendees, they attended the airhacks just to clarify the question. They tried to build a framework around that. And the framework was they wanted to send a JMS message and change the state in a table in the same transaction. And the problem was the database and the JMS broker were two processes. So it was impossible to use local transactions. You had to use distributed transactions. Okay, so now the question is how to solve that. So if you have JMS, the simplest thing to do would be to use the same connection pool for JMS and the database, and the problem is solved. So it's just configuration problem, you are golden. So why? Because JMS will write to the same database as you are already writing with, let's say, JPA, Hibernate, or just straight SQL, and you get consistent data. So this would be the best possible case. I assume you don't use GMS. So what you could also do, you could write into a table and use a scheduler which reads from the table and does something with it. This is actually how the pattern is described. Having said that, the Debezium is not as bad idea. Actually, it's a very good idea, and I proposed it recently in a project. Why? Because if you're using Debezium, there are no dependencies at all. You just have to, to patch the database or patch the database. Debezium will just use your database. It would listen to changes, like logical encoding in Postgres SQL, let's say. And if you write something to a table, the changes are automatically distributed with Kafka. And the only problem is, of course, to set up Kafka properly is not as trivial. So you will have to deal, with distributed brokers and Kafka and fault tolerance and millions of configurations with Kafka. But it is also a good idea, no? And you don't have to use Debezium with Kafka. You could use embedded Debezium as well. So this is actually the idea. So the first idea would be, if you're using GMS, try to map the GMS broker to the same database as you are writing to where your table lives. If you don't have GMS, you could write it by yourself. Just, you have a table with the transactions, and write to the table, and a process will read from table in the same transaction and remove it. So and of course, if you can also use Debezium, and it will listen to database changes, and then it is out. So the communication happens outside your microservices. Just there will be no dependency at all. And of course, what you will have to do, you will have to test Kafka properly. And we already discussed this in a podcast. And I assume, set up Kafka properly may take several weeks. A Kafka cluster. And a single node Kafka, no one cares about that, because single node Kafka means if the node dies, everything goes south. So, yeah. Cool. Markus Zander asked me, I get sometimes error in document write. So now we're switching completely, the context. This is HTML and JavaScript. And if I use lit HTML with browser sync, sometimes in a browser you see document.write, error, warning, and I ignore it completely because it just happens in development time. And yeah, so I'm just ignoring it in my during development time. So the JWTenizr proposes another answer to who was it? To that's ich. This is German. That's ich. And what it says, you could use constraint validator. I wanted to say constraint violator. No, validator. Of course, you could use that, but the constraint validator will have to read the database anyway. So the constraint validator is just like syntactic sugar on top of, the decision how to maintain the consistency. So are you using minishift or OKD origin for your local test? So I'm using minishift, and the reason is I can have set up multiple profiles, and behind the scenes, minishift uses OC cluster up. So I'm actually using both, but officially minishift. And it's good enough for local testing, and it actually works really, really good. And usually all my clients have OpenShift installed, so I use minishift locally. I can switch whenever I like to a remote environment, and it works really nice so far. So JWTenizr, now he asked question is, he asked me, hi Adam, in this blog post you wrote sending an input stream to JaxRS, you showed how to send an input stream to JaxRS resource. And by the way, Markus here, where is Markus? Here is Markus. This is the podcast I wrote, and I recorded. And this podcast, we need the directional data flow with web components, fetch, and custom events. What happened here? This is where the document write problem happened. So this is this reference, and JWTenizr sending an input stream to JaxRS. So someone asked me, how to upload a stream to a server, and I implemented that, and worked well. And now he asks, how to parse the image as an input stream. What I think the question is, how to, if you have a stream, how to create an image afterwards. And Java comes with Java2D library. And what you can do, you can use image.io read, and this is a official Java tutorial. And you can you see there's a file read, and you can also provide a stream, and then you can just read from a URL or from a stream or from file back. You can decode the stream to an image. So it works out of the box. Perfect. Next one, OData, which it's actually good. So Tunji asked me about OData, and it's the Apache library Olingo and implementation. Yes, Olingo is an implementation of OData. This is the Olingo library. And what I don't like on the Olingo library is it is not very well integrated with Java EE. So you could simplify a lot. So Apache Olingo assumes you have only servlets. But so in one project, we went a little bit farther, and I wrote some proof of concept and could actually simplify it a lot. But the question is, what is OData? And OData is similar to GraphQL or GraphQL, and but it is, or I can show you. So what OData is, it provides a consistent API how to query and manipulate database. It was implemented by Microsoft, but it's open standard. And with OData, you can query, you can paginate, you can update resources with standardized API. I don't like the look and feel of the API because this is a camel case, which is unusual for URIs. And also this $select, a little bit strange, but everything is everything is defined, not designed, in the same way. So it always works the same. So it's actually a good idea to standardize that. And Microsoft implement that to expose conveniently a database to the outside world. So you could access very easily tables, for instance. And in the case of Olingo, what you could do, you could just expose entities, JPA entities, as RESTful services, and you don't have to implement any JaxRS resource. So Olingo is particularly interesting for master data management and CRUD use cases. So I think it is even more interesting than GraphQL, because GraphQL is backend for frontend for, let's say, I have already microservices in the backend, and GraphQL would coordinate the microservices. So Apache Olingo is like, it is no coordination, so you're just accessing a data store or exposing the data store. It's less about coordination and more about efficiency and productivity, which is really interesting. So yeah, so Olingo is the implementation. I would say it can be optimized a lot if you are using MicroProfile or Jakarta, because it assumes again that you only have JaxRS servlets, and even the JaxRS implementation is suboptimal, I would say. And I already thought about contribution to Olingo. What's a little bit strange with Olingo, it is not a GitHub project for unknown reasons. So they use a Gitbox, I think. So what I would do is, or if possible, so the first step would be, to expose Olingo to GitHub. This is very important, I would say, for adoption. Okay. So perfect. So I hope. So do you think it's useful in project? It is very useful in projects, and it's absolutely not an overkill, because if you're using Olingo, you don't have to implement anything. You only have the entity. So I would actually, if it works well, I would start with Olingo and then add the JaxRS resources. Okay, now Freifeld Roy asked me, what is the best alternative to injecting managed executor service in MicroProfile in quarkus? And the best alternative, very, very similar, is asynchronous bulkhead. And asynchronous bulkhead, you can specify the waiting task queue. You can specify how concurrent it is. And this is, I would say, 80% of the managed executor service. And Quarkus supports fault tolerance from MicroProfile. So this is my own asynchronous bulkhead with fallback in MicroProfile. This is old pattern from old. It is, I would say, half a year old. And yeah, you can absolutely do this with quarkus. So I would say managed executor service. Instead of using managed executor service, use a bulkhead fault tolerance pattern from MicroProfile. And when injecting MES, some default queue and pool size is given by the application server, and I have to configure everything by myself. So this, I think, unrelated question, because how would you suggest doing that? So I mean, it is well documented in Whitefly. There's a dedicated thread pool, and in Glassfish it is less obvious, but it's also a thread pool. And in MicroProfile, you can configure the bulkheads using MicroProfile config. So it is also well specified. So I would say it depends on the application server you are using. On all application servers, I know you can absolutely configure the managed executor service, the global one, and you can very easily introduce a new one with a new name. So I think you're asking me what is the default configuration, but instead of using the default configuration with managed executor service, I would rather create a new managed executor service completely configured by you, and then this is obvious. And by the way, this managed executor service is sometimes used as a bulkhead pattern, and then you will have to configure a new managed executor service, because if you use one global one, it does not make any sense. And by the way, if you would like to use how to configure them, or it might be useful, what I implemented once is Project Porcupine on GitHub, and it is already used a lot by in several projects. So you could use this, and you can configure everything with annotations, let's say. No, let's say you can configure everything with annotations, and it looks like this. Inject dedicated executor service, and it uses managed threads, and even exposes statistics. So how old is it? Actually, it should be fairly old. The pattern is, wow, 5 years old. Crazy. Okay. Or the pattern, the implementation of the pattern is 5 years. 5 years old. Now, an airhacks attendee, I think, yes, alumni, asked me, I'm reading the Effective Java book by Joshua Block, and in that book, I was advised to use immutable classes, for instance. So everything is final. Yes, I know that. What is your advice about combining Effective Java immutable approach and Java EE? I think in Java EE is not as critical. And the reason for that is because if you have, let's say, a JPA entity in Java EE, it gets exposed over JSON anyway with a serializer, so you always get a copy. So it's actually impossible to expose something via reference. So I actually don't use final a lot, I have to admit, in Java EE and in MicroProfile projects. And also in my code reviews, I don't see a lot of problems with final. What I see a lot of problems, overuse of getters, setters, and then, you know, they use Lombok to generate getters and setters, and it gets crazier and crazier. But I would say it is somehow important outside Java EE to use immutable classes. Why? Because it's, usually you would use singletons, you know, or shared state outside Java EE. Java EE usually the whole state is a request state and is destroyed after the request. So it is immutable somehow anyway, except you are introducing, you know, static singletons, which might be, or which is problematic. So I usually prohibit singletons in Java EE, except, you know, application scoped or at EJB singleton, which contain or maintain configuration state, let's say, then it has to be immutable. But anything else, it does not matter a lot. And for me, you know, lesser code, cleaner code is more important than following strict a pattern with, I would say, not questionable, but I know the added value is not very, very high. So Tunjidir asked me, what should, I actually have no idea who asked that. I think Tunjidir, or what should a Java EE developer know in 2019? I think, you know, using JaxRS, CDI, and JPA is not bad. And I think Kubernetes, because what happened in the recent years, the cluster disappeared and were replaced by Kubernetes. And if you know Java EE clustering, you will understand also Kubernetes. So for me, Kubernetes is like exploded application server. So this is very, very similar. Okay. Now, T Shy Guy, also an Airhacks alumni from last year and is welcome back this year. Please, are there limitations to forking code on GPL? Yes, absolutely. I want to know the implication if I plan to go commercial with my own version. So you can absolutely have commercial forks of GPL, but the forks have to be open source. So what you cannot do is to fork GPL, provide your own changes and keep them secret. So this won't fly, but you have to ask your lawyers. So, and I know some companies prohibit use of GPL code because of the reason. So you are not allowed to use GPL because then everything has to be open sourced. So if you are forking GPL from legal reasons, my understanding is the fork has to be open source, and not only the fork, it has to be buildable and usable. So then you are a good GPL citizen. So this is what. So if you are planning to do something commercial, you can do it absolutely, but it has to be open source. Now, can you explain Dikrtich? Oh no, Divorktich. Ask me, can you explain or even better show us how to use JWTenizr for integration tests in Jenkins? So what is JWTenizr? So I will just close the tabs. JWTenizr is a library which creates JSON web tokens. It's like a simple jar library. And it also creates MicroProfile config configuration with the default token. And you can override the token for testing, the tokens. You can override the roles for testing with a token. So this is the idea. And so the question is how to use it on CI/CD. And on CI/CD, you usually will have system tests. If you search for system tests, I actually recently I even recorded a screencast, and there's a project called status test. And what I did recently, I added to the status test a CI/CD pipeline. And the name of the pipeline is, of course, Jenkins file. And it works on OpenShift already. And at the end, you see the system tests are executed here. So what happens here is Maven facesafe integration test, facesafe verify. This is what happens here. And the question is how to integrate, JWTenizr into the pipeline. And the answer you see already here. So what you will only have to do is to create a loader. So the loader will have to load the token from a file. And this is actually this token. And then add the authorization header. So this is like one line in JaxRS builder. And I would implement a static method which loads the file from a disk and adds that as a value of the header. And then it's integrated. So probably I will screencast would be a little bit messy, but I could actually implement something and then publish on my blog if I find some time. Okay, so thank you. Great question. Captain A asked me, please, how can I use application server, for instance, Payara with Docker to deploy an ear? This is what I show every time. And if you go to Docklands and search for Payara, and then if you create a Java E8 archetype, and I think even being Java EE Docker Thin War or something, if you search for that, so this is actually what you will have to do. You would inherit you would provide a Docker file and say copy target microwar to deployment dir, and you are golden. So this is the answer to your question. So I do it very often. It is even a YouTube screencast. So just take a look on it, and don't use ears. You should use war whenever possible. Now, Alessandro Destasio, also airhacks.com alumni, asked me, yeah, technical questions are boring. So now talk about business. let's say that someone tomorrow wants to start a small business for consultancy development on Java on Jakarta E platform. What's your vision about the billing model? Time-based or feature-based? So I like feature-based more because not as boring. I don't like, to take constantly, watch the time. I would like to, to have the task completed, not, working 8 hours a day. So, but I think you have to be flexible. So some companies will bill you per day, per hour. Others will bill you per feature. And if someone will try to bill me per hour, I would try, to at least be, to be billed by day, not per hour. And in this latter case, do you have any suggestion about the most effective pragmatic way to deal with the issue of work estimates? So I try to keep my contracts as short as possible. So so some clients think even it's very unusual what I'm doing, because I try to have 2-3 days contracts and try to avoid 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks contracts. And then the risk is very, very low, because in worst possible case I will lose a day but not weeks. This is what I do, and it works well, and it never gets boring. So yeah. The problem, of course, is some clients, don't like that, because there's some administrative overhead. So in rare cases, I'm working also for, a few weeks total. But usually I try to keep, my contract short and focused. And this is, then this is easier for my clients and also easier for me, and it's not as boring. And boring is a big deal. So if you are billed, let's say you would be billed by minute, constantly watching, the minutes and hours, is really not that productive. We covered the comments, and Monsieur Shy Guy, also alumni, 7 minutes ago asked me, please do advise developing securities trading solution in PHP. Wow. I mean, PHP battle tested enough for this. I'm trying to justify a move to Java, but it's a battle convincing the business team. I mean, PHP obviously works because Facebook uses PHP, but they compile PHP to C++. Yeah, and PHP. So PHP is a little bit strange. Why is strange? Because lots of EHEX attendees, some of EHEX attendees, they did PHP, and they attended my workshops to learn Java E, and they really like Java E and say this is great and very productive. And other people say, no, Java is too bloated and PHP is great. So it's hard to tell whether PHP, how productive PHP really is. I would say it's really, if you build PHP from scratch and you really know what I'm doing, it is as secure as Java. But I wouldn't use any frameworks. This is the thing, If you just add dependencies to your PHP project, no one knows how they are implemented. So if you really would like to implement something with trading and secure trading platform in PHP, don't use external dependencies or review them at least, because PHP is dynamic and whatever you are pulling in could be insecure. The same is true for Java. This is why I try to avoid dependencies as well. I just focus on the platform. So let's see. So we have no questions, which is remarkable. There are no Blues Boy, and we have a few listeners on the chat. So no questions so far. So we actually covered a lot this time. Thank you for watching, and see you in autumn, in October, and see you of course at the workshops at Munich Airport. Where are the workshops? Or airhacks.com. And yeah, in November and in December 2019. And by the way, there's a new workshop which I forgot to mention here. Java streaming, and we get daily registrations. So if you would like to attend, hurry up. And thank you for watching, and see you next time. Okay, bye.